to walk free in the first place, which takes us to the gatekeeper role of modern traffic stops. If the jury is where your fate is decided, the traffic stop is where the state decides whether you're even going to get there. This is the frontline checkpoint, the place where the power to disrupt your life hides behind a flashing light bar and the words "license and registration, please." Most people think of traffic stops as routine, annoying maybe, but harmless if you've done nothing wrong. That's the myth. The reality? Traffic stops are one of the most efficient legal choke points for controlling who gets funneled into the criminal justice system, and they've inherited the exact logic of Jim Crow Street enforcement. Let's talk about the old playbook. Under Jim Crow, police used vagrancy laws, loitering ordinances, and disturbing the peace charges to stop and detain black citizens at will. These were vague by design, giving officers carte blanche to decide who looked suspicious. A black man walking through a white neighborhood? Suspicious. A black teenager lingering in front of a store? Suspicious. No crime was needed. The stop was the tool. Fast forward to today, and the loitering laws have been replaced by traffic codes so dense that no driver in America could go a week without technically breaking one. A wide turn, a broken taillight, rolling through a stop sign, these are the new magic words. Once an officer has probable cause for the stop, the script writes itself. Run your ID, search your vehicle, find a reason to escalate, and here's where the trap tightens. In many states, even minor infractions carry court fees, and missing a single payment can snowball into a suspended license. Drive with that suspended license, maybe to get to work, maybe to pick up your kids, and now you're committing a misdemeanor. Rack up a few of those and suddenly you're staring at a felony record. The racial data is brutal. Black drivers are disproportionately stopped, searched, and arrested at rates wildly out of proportion to their share of the driving population. In North Carolina, a study found that black drivers were twice as likely to be pulled over for equipment violations. In Illinois, traffic stops for minor infractions are used as pretexts for vehicle searches at significantly higher rates in black communities. And here's the kicker. Just like in the old days, the legal justification doesn't have to match the real motive. Under the Supreme Court's 1996 decision in Warren v. United States, any traffic violation is fair game for a stop, no matter what the officer's actual reason might be. That's a loophole so wide you could drive a prison bus through it. Think about the elegance of this system. You don't need to say, we're targeting black drivers. You just target neighborhoods, patrol patterns, and vehicle conditions that correlate with race and poverty. The law stays neutral on paper, but in practice, the same bodies are being stopped, searched, and cycled into the system. Now connect the dots. You've got representation stolen in the legislature, stacked in the jury box, and filtered at the roadside. What's next? The land under your feet. Because Jim Crow never just controlled bodies, it controlled property. Which is why the next chapter takes us to the legal trap known as heirs property. Many black families, especially in the rural South, acquired land after emancipation, but couldn't access affordable legal services to draft wills or formal deeds. The land passed down informally. Mama's house, Granddad's farm, without a clear title, so all the descendants became co-owners, each holding an undivided interest. On the surface, that sounds fair. Everyone in the family has a piece. In reality, it's a ticking time bomb. Any one co-owner, even a distant relative who never set foot on the land, can go to court and force a partition sale. And here's the kicker. That interest can be sold to an outsider first. Developers, speculators, and timber companies hunt for these fractional shares. Buy one from a distant heir for pennies, then march into court and demand the entire property be sold. The Jim Crow connection? This is a modern refinement of the post-Reconstruction land seizure game. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, black landowners were targeted with discriminatory tax assessments, fraudulent deed transfers, and outright intimidation to force sales. Heirs property laws take the racial hostility out of the language, but keep the result. Land flows out of black hands and into white-controlled development. the scale is staggering. According to the USDA, heirs property is the leading cause of involuntary black land loss in the South. Since 1910, black farmers have lost about 90% of their land, much of it through this legal loophole. These aren't just acres, they're wealth, stability, and political influence. Land is collateral for loans, the foundation for businesses, and the anchor that keeps a family rooted in a community. Lose the land, and you lose all three. Defenders of the system say, well, it's the law. Property rights mean any owner can sell. But that's like saying a chess game is fair because everyone can move the pieces when one player starts with only pawns and the other has a full set. The playing field isn't level when the rules are designed for people with cash, legal expertise, and zero emotional attachment to the land in question. Some states have adopted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act to give families a right of first refusal and require court-ordered appraisals, but many high-loss states still haven't signed on. Meanwhile, the pattern continues. A few $1,000s in a speculator's hand becomes $1 million coastal development, and a family's history is bulldozed without a single eviction notice. If you think this is just about old farms, think again. Land loss shifts entire political maps. When land ownership consolidates, so does local power, the power to zone, to tax, to police. And that brings us to the next front in this war. How access to justice itself can be shaped and denied, not by land or votes, but by the very language you speak in a courtroom. Here's a quick reminder. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful Black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. If losing land can erase your wealth and political footing, losing your voice in court can erase your rights before you even get to argue for them. And in many American courtrooms, that silencing doesn't come from a gavel. It comes from language. We like to imagine justice as blind, but in reality, she's hard of hearing if you don't speak English fluently. In immigration courts, housing disputes, domestic violence cases, and even criminal trials, defendants and witnesses who don't have strong English skills often face proceedings without competent interpretation. Sometimes they get no interpreter at all. Sometimes they get someone with no legal training. Sometimes they get someone translating into a dialect they barely understand. And here's the ugly truth. The courts know this happens, and the law lets it slide. While criminal defendants have a constitutional right to an interpreter under the Sixth Amendment, civil litigants, in cases involving child custody, eviction, wage theft, or asylum, often have no such guarantee. The result? People are losing homes, children, and even their legal status in the U.S. because they literally couldn't understand the words being used against them. The Jim Crow connection? It's the same playbook as literacy tests. During the Jim Crow era, states used understanding clauses to block black citizens from voting. These clauses required a voter to interpret a section of the state constitution to the registrar's satisfaction. The registrar decided whether the answer was right, and if you were black, it never was. Language wasn't just a tool of communication, it was a weapon of exclusion. Today's language barrier is more subtle but no less lethal. In asylum cases, mistranslations can twist testimony, turning a credible fear of persecution into a minor disagreement with neighbors. In housing court, a tenant who doesn't catch a judge's warning about deadlines can lose by default. In criminal court, a bad interpretation can make a plea deal sound like a dismissal, until the defendant finds themselves in prison. The official excuse is cost. Court systems claim they can't afford professional interpreters in every language, especially rare ones. But that's a convenient cover. In reality, denying access to proper interpretation keeps cases moving quickly and cheaply, overwhelmingly, to the detriment of marginalized communities. It's efficiency over fairness, just as it was when literacy tests sped voters out of line. Consider this. In some states, over half of agricultural workers who already face exploitation speak indigenous languages, not Spanish. Yet court systems often send them Spanish interpreters, leaving them just as lost as if no one had shown up at all. In legal terms, they're represented, In reality, they're voiceless. And when people are stripped of their voice in court, it doesn't just affect their cases. It sends a signal to entire communities. The legal system is not yours. Stay quiet. Stay away. Now think about the next domino. If you can be silenced in court with a language barrier, what happens in the places where your very survival depends on equal treatment, like the hospital? That's where the next thread of Jim Crow's legal DNA shows up, and it's still costing lives. If the courtroom can strip away your voice, the hospital can strip away your life. And here's the uncomfortable truth. American healthcare may have removed the whites-only signs, but it never dismantled the walls they were nailed to. Walk into any major city and compare hospitals. In predominantly white, affluent areas, you'll see gleaming facilities with state-of-the-art equipment, endless specialist departments, and short wait times. In poorer majority black neighborhoods, you'll often find underfunded hospitals, fewer specialists, outdated technology, and emergency rooms so overcrowded that patients wait hours, sometimes days, for a bed. Some people wave this off as a funding issue, but the funding formulas themselves are soaked in history. Hospitals that serve wealthier areas pull in more revenue because they get higher insurance reimbursements and larger donations from patients. Meanwhile, hospitals in poorer areas rely heavily on Medicaid, which pays less, locking them into a cycle of underinvestment. That's the present-day face of an old system. The Jim Crow connection? Under separate but equal, hospitals were segregated by law across much of the South. White hospitals received the lion's share of funding and resources. Black hospitals, if they existed at all, were chronically understaffed and under-equipped. When desegregation laws finally hit, those underfunded black hospitals were often shut down entirely, and the surrounding black communities were expected to travel to white hospitals that didn't welcome them. The result? Generations of mistrust and reduced access still shape healthcare patterns today. This isn't just about where hospitals are located. It's also about how patients are treated when they get there. Studies have repeatedly shown that black patients are less likely to receive pain medication, more likely to have their symptoms underestimated, and less likely to be referred to specialists compared to white patients with the same conditions. These biases don't come from nowhere. They're the lingering medical culture of an era when black patients were viewed as biologically different and often less deserving of care. And here's where the legal shield comes in. Unlike education or voting, healthcare access doesn't have a sweeping constitutional guarantee. There's no right to a hospital bed enshrined in law. That means disparities can persist for decades, as long as they're framed as the result of market forces rather than discrimination. This is the same legal dodge Jim Crow used in other arenas. Deny that the inequality is intentional, and the law will look the other way. The COVID-19 pandemic ripped the cover off these inequalities. Black Americans were hospitalized and died at disproportionately high rates, not because of biology, but because they were more likely to live in medically underserved areas, work frontline jobs, and lack insurance. Yet when advocates demanded systemic healthcare reform, they hit the same wall civil rights activists hit in the 1960s. Political resistance to spending extra resources on communities that had been underfunded for generations. If you think a hospital can't discriminate without saying it out loud, you're missing the point. Jim Crow didn't need to tell you to stay out of the white hospital. It just made sure the one you could enter wasn't equipped to save you. And today, that logic lives on in resource maps and reimbursement charts instead of color-coded waiting rooms. So if life itself can still be rationed along old racial fault lines, what about the air you breathe and the water you drink? That's where the next ghost of Jim Crow lives, not in a hospital ward, but in the zoning board's filing cabinet. If hospitals can quietly decide who lives and who dies, zoning boards can quietly decide where people live and what poisons they breathe. And the U.S. has been astonishingly consistent in deciding whose lungs are disposable. Look at the map of hazardous waste sites, oil refineries, and chemical plants, and you'll see a pattern that's too precise to be a coincidence. They cluster in or next to predominantly black neighborhoods, not just one or two cities nationwide. From Cancer Alley in Louisiana to the lead-contaminated water of Flint, Michigan, the message is the same. Certain communities are sacrifice zones, places where pollution and health risks are simply part of the cost of doing business. The defenders of this system will tell you it's not racism, it's economics. Land is cheaper where people are poorer, so that's where industry goes. But that argument crumbles under the weight of history. The land is cheaper in those neighborhoods because of decades of discriminatory housing policy, redlining, restrictive covenants, predatory lending, and deliberately depressed property values in black areas. That's not an accident. It's the financial residue of segregation. The Jim Crow connection? During the segregation era, zoning laws were explicitly used to separate black and white residents, not just by housing, but by land use. Industrial zones were deliberately placed near black neighborhoods, bringing noise, pollution, and dangerous jobs right to their doorsteps. White neighborhoods were zoned for residential or commercial use, keeping their air and water cleaner. When segregation by race was outlawed, the practice didn't end. They just stripped the racial language from the zoning code and kept the industrial maps the same. The legal trick that keeps this alive today is the intent requirement. Under U.S. civil rights law, to win an environmental racism case, you have to prove that decision-makers intended to discriminate. It's not enough to show that your community is suffering from toxic air, higher cancer rates, or poisoned water compared to a white neighborhood. Unless you can unearth smoking gun evidence, an email, a statement, or a memo that explicitly mentions race, the courts will say it's not illegal. The system doesn't care if the result looks exactly like Jim Crow's environmental map, as long as no one admits that's what they were aiming for. This legal insulation is why the same neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s often map perfectly onto neighborhoods with the highest pollution exposure today. It's a direct pipeline from segregation-era policy to present-day public health disaster. And here's the cold part. Environmental damage isn't just about sickness, it's about time. If a child grows up with asthma from refinery emissions, they're more likely to miss school, struggle academically, and face economic disadvantages for life. That's the same intergenerational harm Jim Crow built into every other part of its system. Disadvantage at birth, compounded over decades. Now ask yourself, if the state can decide whose environment is toxic and get away with it, what's stopping it from deciding whose access to the modern economy is crippled before they even log on? That's where we find the next mutation of Jim Crow, not in the soil, but in the fiber optic cables. Look closely at broadband expansion maps from the past 2 decades. In major cities, high-speed internet was rolled out first to wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. Meanwhile, poorer and predominantly black neighborhoods were left with outdated copper lines, slower speeds, and in many cases, no service at all. This wasn't because the technology couldn't reach them. It's because telecom companies decided those areas weren't worth the investment. That phrase, worth the investment, is where the ghost of Jim Crow starts whispering. Under segregation, municipalities openly denied infrastructure improvements to black neighborhoods, claiming they weren't economically viable. Paved roads, sewage systems, street lighting, these upgrades went to white areas first, if black neighborhoods got them at all. Broadband is just the latest utility to inherit this discriminatory investment logic. This isn't some distant history. In 2017, an investigation by the Center for Public Integrity found that AT&T, Verizon, and other major providers offered their fastest broadband speeds in white, affluent neighborhoods, while charging the same price for slower service in black neighborhoods. They didn't say it was because of race. They said it was because of market demand. But when your market demand models are built on maps shaped by decades of housing segregation, you end up recreating the same old racial fault lines. The legal angle? There's no explicit constitutional right to internet access. That means broadband discrimination doesn't trigger the same civil rights protections as, say, school segregation. Unless it can be proven as intentional racial discrimination again, that impossible intent standard. There's no clear federal legal remedy. This is how the game works. You design a system where discrimination happens automatically, and then you insist that no one planned it. The human cost is massive. Students in underconnected neighborhoods fall behind because they can't complete online assignments. Job seekers can't access remote work opportunities. Small businesses can't compete in the digital marketplace. This isn't about being inconvenienced. It's about being locked out of the 21st century economy entirely. And here's the kicker. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when schools and workplaces moved online overnight, these same communities were the hardest hit. Children sat outside fast food restaurants to use free Wi-Fi for homework. Families rationed mobile data just to keep up with classes. In the same way, segregated schools kept black students from accessing the same education as their white peers. Digital redlining keeps entire neighborhoods from accessing the same knowledge and opportunity. If Jim Crow could see the internet age, it wouldn't need to rewrite its laws. It would just buy stock in a telecom company. The principle is identical. Deny infrastructure to certain communities, and you don't have to bar them from opportunity. The barrier builds itself. But if the internet is the modern classroom, the next battleground isn't just about access to the network. It's about what's taught once you're inside it. That's where the old logic of segregation has slipped into school funding formulas, shaping the future before it's even begun. If the internet is the modern classroom, then money is the oxygen that keeps that classroom alive. And in America, the oxygen tanks are still labeled by zip code, a practice that conveniently keeps the old racial hierarchy intact without ever mentioning race. Here's the setup. Public schools in the United States are largely funded through local property taxes. That means wealthier neighborhoods, the ones with higher property values, can pour more money into their schools. Poorer neighborhoods with lower property values get less. On paper, it's not about race. In reality, those property values are the direct descendants of redlining maps, restrictive covenants, and decades of segregation policy. This is why two schools separated by just a few miles can have radically different worlds inside. In one district, students walk into gleaming buildings with state-of-the-art science labs, a library full of current books, and teachers who aren't juggling 5 classes worth of overcrowded students. On the other hand, kids sit under leaky ceilings, share outdated textbooks, and are taught by teachers who burn out faster because they're underpaid and undersupported. The defenders of this system will argue it's local control, communities funding their schools. But that argument assumes all communities start with equal resources, which they don't. Jim Crow's housing policies made sure of that. By concentrating black families in areas with depressed property values and limited economic growth, segregation planted the seed for today's school funding inequality. And because property values rarely catch up once they've been suppressed for decades, the cycle is self-reinforcing. The legal precedent? The Supreme Court tackled this in San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez 1973. Families from a poor, mostly Mexican-American district argued that the funding system violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court disagreed. Education, they said, is not a fundamental right under the Constitution, and disparities in funding aren't necessarily unconstitutional. That ruling slammed the door shut on using the courts to force equal funding, leaving the inequity baked into the system. Think about what that means. Jim Crow segregated schools by law. The civil rights movement desegregated them in theory. But the property tax system resegregated them in practice, locking in a funding gap so vast it might as well be written into the state constitution. And the effects go far beyond the classroom. Lower school funding means fewer advanced courses, which means fewer competitive college applications, which means lower lifetime earnings. It's not just an education gap, it's a wealth gap disguised as a budget spreadsheet. So here we are, decades past the official death of Jim Crow, and yet the same streets that once carried colored-only signs now carry invisible price tags. Those price tags decide which children breathe the fresh air of opportunity and which ones choke on the recycled dust of generational neglect. This isn't a glitch in the system, it is the system, refined and rebranded. The court rulings may have buried segregation in the law books, but the funding formulas and property lines keep resurrecting it in the real world. Until we confront that truth head-on, post-segregation America will remain exactly what it is now: segregation with better PR. If Jim Crow's gone, why do lines still shape our schools? Can equality exist when zip codes decide futures? Let us know in the comment section. Did we just give segregation a makeover? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here, we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.